Hello and welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm with Maxwell Flitton. He is the author of Rust Web Programming, a hands-on guide to developing, packaging, and deploying fully functional Rust web applications, both the first and second edition. Now this is all about your second edition. That's very much a mouthful, the full title of the book. Did you come up with the full title yourself?
No, the publisher did.
Lots of keywords, I think.
Yeah, I think they want keywords. They're also, this type of publisher is very keen on trying to make things as easy to, as expressive as possible, I think. That's their style.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, right? We were talking a little bit before the show. One of the things that you talked about that I thought was really interesting and forward-thinking is that you said that you wrote the first edition fairly quickly so that you can get the second edition out when other people were still getting their first edition out, right? Isn't that what you said?
Yeah, it's because, it was changing quite rapidly. And also, as software engineers, we know that when you build something, you get edge cases that come up, and then it's a time to try and refactor and that sort of thing. So that's why I focused on the book in terms of in one of the chapters, actually, you look at a very old Stack Overflow question on how to do middleware, but you cover the concepts before, so then you can kind of read and digest and understand how they're getting to that. But we obviously don't recommend in the book that then you implement that. We show the new version and stuff like this. So it's to try and build on it, get feedback, smooth out the errors, that sort of thing. Because I think this is sometimes you're always a bit nervous when you look at reviews because some people say, oh, there's an error in XYZ. And it's like when you're doing so many chapters and there's so many moving parts, and then there's reviewers, they want changes and stuff like this. It gets to the point where sometimes you have to stop and say, that's good enough, if you know what I mean. It's not, otherwise you'll always be constantly chasing. I'm not saying that you see an error and you think, whatever, I'm going to ship it. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Actually, I'm kind of curious about when you put out a second edition, number one, who starts up the conversation? Is it you or the publisher?
So I initially talked to PacT, actually. So I started up the conversation. And this was actually, I was originally a Python developer, and I still do quite a bit of Python. And so me and the co-founder on a side project, we started building medical simulation software that the German government kind of picked up, and it was on a Kubernetes cloud, and we used Flask and Python and stuff like this, and started getting interested in Rust. This is quite a few years back. And then when we actually started to put Rust servers into our Kubernetes cluster, server costs just absolutely tanked, and the CPU usage just completely dropped. And it's just this is insane. And then I started looking around, and I was like, I can't attest for everybody on the internet, but every time I looked at the internet, people kept saying it was a systems language at the time. And I was like, well, with the memory safety and the traits and stuff like this, if you are a bit smart about the web programming, you can be quite productive, and you can have really fast servers that are going to scale very well and be a fraction of the cost in terms of your server bill. And PacT, I just approached them and they were very keen at the time.
But this subject, right? It's kind of interesting that you talk about the Python side, right? This is your third book or your second, is it?
I've got two titles, but this is my third book because one title was two editions. So yeah, I'm a bit of a fanatic about Rust. I think it's the future, but I'm also maybe a bit worried in terms of I don't always think the best technology always gets adopted for really bizarre reasons. Sometimes it's political, sometimes just a company decides to go in a different direction or something like this. So if you look at my approach, it's generally around adopting Rust. So in the web book, it assumes no knowledge of Rust, and it says, if you come from language like JavaScript or Python, you already know what loops are, you already know what classes and functions are, and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to focus on giving you a quick grounding on the borrow checker, different quirks around Rust, and then I'm going to get you grounded very quickly on building apps, in Rust. And then that's also why I really pushed for the second book, which was speeding up your Python with Rust, because my background was Python. I tried to get it adopted into the company I was working at the time. Rust, I said, this is amazing, but they were concerned because they had mainly Python systems. So I figured out if I try and give people some grounding into how Python can be injected, how Rust can be injected into Python, then it can give some people some low kind of friction into testing out Rust, essentially.
Yeah, I would have thought that your first book would be about speeding up your Python with Rust rather than the other way around. So actually the web first edition was your first book.
Yeah, I guess. Maybe looking back, that was probably a better order. But it was after just like the heels of like deploying these Rust servers into Kubernetes and seeing, I guess I got a bit too human, a bit too emotional, and I was just very excited about just seeing how powerful Rust was in web development. And hopefully as well with the second edition, because the first edition, Attic's web was still changing a lot. So you did a bit of old fashioned middleware in the main function and stuff like this. With the traits, where you do the from request traits and stuff like that, I actually argue to some people that you can mostly be as productive as you are in Python actually when it comes to web development, especially simple CRUD applications. You can implement traits very easily, and then with Serrade and stuff like this, and merely just like passing them through functions. I found after a while it was the same work to build something in a Flask app in Python than it was to build it in Attic's web once you've got your traits implemented.
I can imagine it would be about the same, almost about the same development speed, but then you wouldn't have like these, you'd have the type checking to kind of help you out with some things, right? Sometimes you write in Python, you run it and it crashes because you got something you didn't expect, or you changed something upstream and then you have to pay for it later on, right?
Yeah, that's also a thing. I guess it's like, I can't remember where I read it, but there was somebody saying that Rust is the most boring language that they've coded in, because once they coded the app, it never really threw any bugs and they didn't really have to revisit it and start working out why it was doing X, Y, Z, because the type checking and the borrow checker kind of beat you into making sure it's correct initially.
Yeah, I can understand. Like, I had this app that worked so well that the people in charge of making sure services are running were a little bit concerned that it wasn't actually working because it never actually broke. They literally had to shut down one of the services to see the errors pile up for them to actually believe there was no issue because they're so used to everything just falling down all the time. The funny thing is that one was actually written in Python. That was actually the funny thing. But yeah, that one, we tested the hell out of that thing with a lot of automated testing and some manual testing. So when we did deploy it, everything just worked out of the box. And like I said, a little bit too well. That was the problem. And then,
Yeah,
but you get that syndrome where it's like you make a bug and then everybody knows about it because it's some big problem. And then you fix it and then you look like the superhero, but actually, you're the one who made the bug to begin with. So you kind of feel like
yeah.
also the villain.
Yes, yeah. You get all that drama chopped out with Rust. This is the same. We had exactly the same thing. So we were running stuff, obviously, in Python initially. And yeah, there was always something going wrong. You'd have to test it manually and all this sort of stuff a few times with tracing and all that. When we actually did our first distroless layered build, where the image was like 50 megabytes, we wondered whether it was actually running at all, and we had to check our sanity because the build was so quick. Pulling a 50 megabyte image is super quick, and then it took up barely any CPU. Never complained, and there's that weird uneasiness. I guess it's kind of like your spouse when they're so happy they don't complain or something, and you get a bit paranoid, and you say, really everything's fine, but you're thinking, what's going on?
Oh yeah, it's like the calm before the storm, basically. Or you're in the eye of the tornado, right? And it's very calm. That's the calm part, right? When you're right in the middle of it.
And then you quickly realize that like it's never been adding anything to the database for a full week or something like that.
Oh, wow, I haven't had that. That's an interesting problem to have.
No, that's the fear.
Oh,
It
oh,
hasn't
that's a
happened.
fear. I thought you said that actually happened to you.
No, because it's so like it doesn't complain at all. You're thinking like, oh gosh, I'm gonna turn up next week and it's just hasn't been working for a week or something.
Yeah, I think I've had that with clients before where like we weren't really writing automated tests and then we switched to it because I thought it was a good idea and things were stable and guy was like, "Can you like double check to make sure it's working okay because we haven't had any errors in a while." It's like, yeah, it looks like we got data. People are using the app. Looks okay." Well, what made you so like? Is it that you had this really great experience turning some of your Python services into Rust services that you just wanted to get the word out there? So you thought you really need to kind of write this into a book and spread the word and try to bring more education to the audience?
Yes, I mean we spoke about it before the podcast, but maybe for the listeners, we both agree on the point that you're not really going to get rich with a book once the online retailer has taken their slice, and then the publisher needs to keep the lights on. You get a fraction of what's left. It's more about, I really believe in this technology and I want it to keep going. I want the adoption to happen. I think it would generally be better. It is a mixture of everything, and in terms of it's quite fun to code in. It's very safe. It's fast, but also as well, like, and this is something that's at the back of my head. It's not the forefront, but it's just very energy efficient. Like we found that the AWS reports recently said that it's second to C in terms of energy usage. And the AWS was saying that Rust is maybe the key to sustainability in this sense. And also, it's like quite reassuring. So you could argue, okay, if you coded in C and C++, you'd get those speeds and you get those energy usages, but then you worry about like memory safety and that sort of thing.
Some people say that's the reason why it's so fast, is because you do need to worry about that. It doesn't have all that safety bound checking, right? You just do whatever you want.
In C++.
Yeah, C++, right? Like if you look at Python, there's lots of checking involved, right? As you came from that side. And
Hmm.
with C, right, there's nothing. You could just start right to wherever the heck you want in memory for the most part. You can do whatever the hell you want. And that's kind of like part of it, is because you don't have all that kind of hand holding and checking and kind of safety in there, right?
Yeah, I guess. But that's the thing, that's where Rust really comes in, right? It doesn't have a garbage collector, but also you are rest assured that you're having memory safe applications, which I think is pretty nice. And also as well, I found with Rust, because of its like quite aggressive checking and borrow checker and stuff like this, you kind of get forced into writing good code. So my day job, I work at an open source foundation and we calculate like financial loss on a geographical scale for like weather events and stuff like this. And it's open source, so third world countries can access this sort of stuff at a much cheaper price. But a lot of the code is written in C++, and I rewrote some of it, which was the average like loss calculation of a certain geographical area in Rust, and we got like a 4 times speed up. Now, anyone who knows what C++ is knows that if it was implemented exactly the same way, you wouldn't have that difference. But I think it is that kind of like aggressive like borrow checking and that sort of thing as well. It kind of forces you to be a bit more considerate about what you're writing. And that's the thing that maybe Python is also a bit damaging or a bit bad for, is that because you can write anything any way you want, however you want, and it does all the stuff in the background, you can write some ridiculously inefficient code. You just will not even hear a peep from Python in this sense. It's like a classic one is looping through and adding to a string. So copying that string constantly, and then you sometimes see on Stack Overflow Python developers going, why is it so much slower than join or something like this, and then there's somebody saying, oh, it's because it's at pre-allocating the memory. So I think that as well, it's Rust kind of like makes you write good code.
Yeah, I think if you look at the same action in Python versus Rust, it's just, I don't know how you say it. Like even in like not the most performant Rust code, right? With like maybe you just keep allocating more heap memory, you're still gonna be faster because of the way things work. This is
Yeah.
quite interesting because that virtual machine from Python is doing a lot of stuff underneath the hood, like allocating for all kinds of stuff, because it's not just an object with the data that you have that you want. There's also lots of other crap that's being, all this metadata that I understand is going to be underneath all these different objects that need to be there, right?
Yes. I think the key thing that's quite succinct about understanding the differences is that Python's kind of memory map is a bit more like a graph, whereas
Mm.
Rust is more like a tree. So it's a bit more constrictive, but ultimately, I think more concise and cleaner.
Yeah, I also think so. But coming back to, actually, I kind of like to go a little bit to your past, right? Because well, as we discussed before the show, I think your book is #1 in bioinformatics, right? And we're thinking that could be
Yeah.
from your past, right? Because your past is, you were never, like, you didn't go to school for programming, right? You went to school for something else.
Yeah. So I grew up in Norfolk, and it's kind of like the countryside, and in a background where you didn't really think much about your future. And I went into nursing. And for those who are unaware of the UK situation, we have an NHS, so National Health Service. And at the time, they paid for your nursing degree. So it's kind of like joining the military. It's like, oh, if you wanted to get a degree and you didn't want to pay any tuition, you could go and do nursing. So at the age of 18, no one really knows what they really want to do. And then when I was in A&E, I was treating a patient who had a heart attack, but it wasn't a serious heart attack. You get these different grades. His is very minor. He's just waiting for blood tests. And he was kind of like, he was grading papers, mathematical papers. And to me, it looked like wizardry. So I was just like, what is that? He said, oh, I'm a physics professor. So he gave me his email and I went and saw his lab on my day off and I was blown away. So I studied physics and I wanted to go into medical physics. And I started doing postgrad in medical physics, but then quickly realized that because it's an NHS, there's pros and cons. And one of the cons is that it's actually not very innovative on the technology side. In fact, they still use fax machines and stuff like that to send messages to each other. And yeah, if you Google like NHS IT scandal. The computer systems are terrible, and there was a recent scandal. And I'm not getting political. This is just a comment on the IT system. They were tracking COVID cases on a national level on Excel. And because these COVID tests were in Excel badly formatted, they wiped off like quite a lot of the positive cases and they didn't follow up on quite a few things. So you get an insight into actually how the NHS is in this sense. So if you want to do like med tech and medical physics, it's really not the place really for you. So ends up going into financial tech because London is a financial hub, and software engineering. And then fell in love with it ever since and not stopped.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess you're happy you kind of fell into Rust, right? Because that's really changed your programming like thought process too, I would think, no?
Yes, yeah, very excited about that. Kind of getting excited about actors, that sort of thing in Rust, the actor model framework, which is what the second edition, the end stage of the second edition book actually focuses on building actors in Tokyo and building like worker nodes that consume from Redis and stuff like this. I think it's a very exciting field. And it's quite challenging, right? It forces you to think in a different way.
Actually, that's a good kind of segue, right? Because I do want to talk more about the book, right? So, do you mind to kind of go into the flow of the book? I mean, obviously, we can go through and read the table of contents, but it reads kind of like, A, B, C, there's no segues in between, right? I mean, is it supposed to be meant to read from front to back, or is it that we can skip around, or how does the kind of the flow of the book work?
Yeah, it's supposed to be so you can follow it through, and it follows through all the way up to, I'd say, chapter 13, from 1 to 13, on how to build a to-do app, which is a classic example, I guess. And that's because you can have like a user account that can have to-do things, and then you have your authentication, your database migrations. But it starts with like structuring Rust code properly. So, you have your individual modules, and then you have like interfaces, and maybe you have a factory that can create to-do structs. And then because of the way we structure it in very modular ways, even though we build it up in Attic, in the Rocket chapter, we just copy and paste our modules, change a few of the traits, and then we have it all running in Rocket. It's to try and take the user on a journey, because I appreciate that books, they're not really going to give you like the most cutting edge API references. They're going to get dated, and that's the concern that a lot of people have when you say, "I'm writing a book in Rust," and they say, "Oh, the landscape is changing. It will be out of date very quickly." And it's like, yeah, there will be some API references that will get out of it. So it's more like, this is how you structure it. This is the concept. But it should be that once you've gone that book, you could just update yourself on the documentation of a certain crate or something like that. So I kind of got that because I did a bit of teaching computational medicine at Imperial College. So I figured, it's more about teaching the person how to actually process new information, how to structure their thing, where to look, what is the underlying meaning of this, So if you implement a trait that does from request to do middleware, then you're looking for like, oh, are there other traits I can implement in a crate that will enable me to do certain things, you know? And then I guess as well, we also cover HTTPS, the actual protocols, Nginx, and we use Terraform to like deploy it onto AWS. But with that, it's a bit ropey, and it's because we use a lot of Bash and stuff because I want to be CI agnostic. So I do stress that you don't learn that bit and then say, right, I'm going to implement that in production. You learn the core basics of like building a Docker image that's distroless, deploying it onto Docker Hub, pulling it. But you should try and do that sort of logical steps in some sort of CI tool, that would help. And then after that, we go into the Tokyo framework. We look at TCP, and then we kind of build a basic HTTP framing on top of TCP. So you kind of get a feel for like the relationship between HTTP and TCP. And then you start building actors and start using async and stuff like this. So you can start doing kind of more advanced kind of patterns, with actors. And that's pretty much the book, to be honest.
I found it interesting that you actually use actors, right? Because I don't hear a lot of people using some type of actors in their system very much. I mean, of course, it was Actix originally had actors, but now Actix
Yes.
Web is basically have nearly nothing to do with Actix. Of course, unless you want to use WebSocket, then you need actual Actix core or Actix in your system. That's what I understand, right? Okay, you're shaking your head yes. You didn't say anything for a while. I was like, am I wrong? This is what I remember reading.
Yeah. I mean, from what I remember, I just double check because I've got the computer with me. The actor model hasn't really been updated in quite a while. I think it's a dying crate. I mean, I'm not too hot on that
I
pulse,
think
but
the pattern is a little bit dying to somewhat extent, right? I don't hear a lot of people actually looking at that pattern anymore.
yeah, so that's the thing. That's why actors are kind of like in the, like near the end, and it's kind of like how you can actually build like worker nodes that consume off a queue or something. But I'm pretty sure like there's other things, that you can do as well. There's production ready stuff you can buy on Amazon Marketplace or something like that. It's more of an exercise. But Alice, and I'm gonna butcher her last name. Rahel? Alice Rahel? RYHL. She's kind of like reviving the actors a bit. So she's a main contributor to Tokyo, and then she covers like how to actually build actors in Tokyo and send messages to each other. The actor model is, yeah, it's going in different areas. So I was recently talking to some people from the Bank of England and UCL, and there are some papers in using actors to like simulate economical outcomes and models, because it's from agent based, which is like, so agent based modeling is term based, actors is kind of like more real time. So there is might be some interest in that sort of sense as well. Also, as well, like we were looking into actors because in our medical simulation software, we started to move towards real time event processing. So, like if you send a patient off, they take X amount of time before they come back. It takes X amount of time for their results to come back. So that's another kind of way we were using it essentially. But it's not something that you reach for, and I want to push against the notion that you run around with the actor model in your head and you're looking for problems to solve with it. It's more of, kind of like some weird situations or some edge cases where it become useful. So event-driven systems, actors are quite useful, but how I've only ever really worked on event-driven systems like once or twice. So I appreciate it's not as common.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I work a lot with Elixir and Erlang, so I mean, the actor pattern is basically nearly it's core to the way it works. So, and I find it really convenient. That's why I find it a little bit interesting that it kind of like died out in Rust. But I do see people like when I do searching about actors in Rust, like there's still some people who are asking questions like, "Hey, how can I do actor pattern?" And they're like me, come from like the VM, and they're like, "Hey, I like this thing, but and I also like Rust, and I want to do this in Rust, but there's no like central library where we can have the supervision tree and the actor model kind of running." So that's kind of the one of the things I wish would come back, which is kind of like what Actors Core was all about. They have like the same kind of style.
Well, maybe this is an ambition for the future then, to try and enact some sort
Yeah.
of like actor crate. And this is something else. So O'Reilly have contacted me and reached out to actually write a book on async Rust. And in that outcome, in that outline, it's gone through a few review stages and stuff like this. We do actually lean on the actor model quite a bit in there. And so different design patterns and that sort of thing. So hopefully, you know, we could rekindle the act kind of like community, I guess, in Rust. Because async Rust is quite powerful. There are some people that are concerned that there's some changes coming up to async Rust. And I think maybe that's
Mhm.
why maybe some people are holding off or something. But Tokyo is quite powerful, and I think you can definitely implement
Yeah.
actors in there.
But like you said, that's in the article. Alice talks about how to do that just with Tokyo, which is pretty cool.
Yeah,
So that's something I wanted to return. I think because she was actually on the podcast, that's why I know about that article. It's quite an old article. I think it's last year, even the year before that. It was quite some time ago. And then, of course, she updated it.
yeah. I contacted her saying like, "Thank you for the inspiration," and so on. And there was a Rust event in Italy she was going to, and she said, "Oh, we can meet there." But then the organizers never got back to me. I don't know why. They just stopped. I had other things going on, so
Yeah, it's good to hear that. I mean, do you figure you're going to be a guy who's constantly writing books? Because it seems like you caught the writing fever these days.
yeah. I think you kind of get used to it after a while. Because it takes a good year, I think, to write a book, and you carve aside, so much time that it kind of becomes a bit standardized. So another good example of this is, let's say, it's a bit off the wall, but in the UK, childcare is insanely expensive. It's thousands, a month, and there's people that we know who say, "Oh, I'd never send my kid to private school," but because they were so used to paying thousands a month in their nursery school, kindergarten, they just kind of slip into it. And I think it's the same with writing a book. I think you carve away X amount of time, weekly or daily or something like that to write a book. So when that's finished, it's kind of like a bit of a void, or it's like, oh, I could go on to another one, because you've kind of maybe it's Stockholm syndrome or something. You just kind of got used to just plugging away at something like that. So it gets a bit, okay, let's do another one. And I think as well, like publishers, they are a business and stuff. And there's very superficial things as well that they have to factor in. Like, are you someone that can get the chapters in on time? Do you respond to constructive feedback? Can you actually write and stuff like that? And I think that kind of snowballs the offers that you get. After you've done a couple, people say like, oh, well, I'm sure there's better Rust developers out there compared to me, but I guess they're thinking like, oh, he's going to deliver on time. He's not going to be a complete diva with an editor or something like that. So it just end up slipping into the next one.
I kind of like think about, I mean, your wife just had a baby. I kind of think about writing books as a little bit like having a child, and to a certain extent. I mean, at least like the whole process, because you're like, yeah, this is exciting. I'm going to be happy to do it. You start doing it and you're like, oh, this is such a bad idea. And why did I do this? This is horrible. And then you finish it and you're like, oh, I'm very proud of what I have now. That was actually not so bad. Let's do another one. And then you go back to the cycle. It's kind of like having a child. And it's almost like having a child, because with birth from your mind, right? All these things.
Exactly. Yeah. You get selective memory, 100%. So when I told my wife that O'Reilly contacted me, she was just like, "You're not going to do another one, are you? You hate writing them." And it's like, do I? And I think if I force myself to remember, there are some late nights where I'm just like, why am I doing this? I should be doing something else. I hate this. And then you get to the ends and stuff, like as you said, and then you get like the positive comments on Reddit and stuff like that. And people contact you and they say, oh, I read your book. It helped me. So I guess that kind of like weird topsy-turvy kind of like effort reward kind of thing is maybe you forget the amount of effort and you feel the reward, and it's all kind of, I guess, just like childbirth or something. My wife is at the minute tired. So am I. He cries at like 2 a.m. and stuff like this. But I'm sure when he sleeps all the way through, having another baby is going to be a bit more, enticing.
Yeah. I do know what you're talking about. Like, I think the biggest motivation for me is when people who have the things that you did come back to you and say that was helpful. Like, that is like motivation. You're like, maybe I should go back. Like, because I used to do a lot of videos, like one video a week for some Elixir tutorials on YouTube, and I stopped doing it for a couple of weeks. It's just too crazy busy and working on a couple other things. And I've been wanting to get back to it. And once in a while, people will come to me and say, hey, I miss your videos. Like, when are you going to make a new one? And I was like, really? Because sometimes I think almost anything you output, book, videos, blogs, it's like shouting into the wilderness, and then like nothing ever echoes back. And then finally someday
Yes.
you get an echo back, like somebody come to you and say, hey, that thing you did, I loved it. When can you go back to it? Or when can you do this? Or I have questions, or that was helpful. Right. And you're like, oh,
Yes.
somebody actually used and liked and enjoyed my stuff. I had no idea, because I just put it out there, and I don't know, like when you sell a book, right? I think you get an advance on the royalties. So it's like, well, I got my check for my book, and it's not like you're not getting like a daily check of like, okay, here's like 3 cents or whatever it is your cut of the book royalties, right? You get like a lump sum in the beginning, and then they slowly take that off, is what I understand. I mean, you don't have to tell me yes or no, but that's what I understand, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
You get an advance, and
you
then
can
so it's
advance,
like,
yeah. And then it slowly ticks down to finally you start getting, maybe a monthly or bi-monthly check or something, right?
yeah, it's like radio silence for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I guess there's also like a period where people actually have to read the book. So you're not really getting any feedback there because you're not, the first month or something, unless you've got some very diligent, hardcore readers, it's usually a bit delayed before you start hearing people saying, oh, I built this because of it, or something like that. And it's sometimes a bit, like a bit awkward. Like there's a guy from Panama in the banking industry, and he read the Python to Rust kind of book. Nice guy, smart, very hardworking, obviously very driven. He wanted to try and adopt Rust into the bank, but like he said loads of compliments when he called me, and I felt very awkward, because you don't really know what to say because it's like the first time you meet someone, so you sometimes get that as well, and you think, I don't know how to navigate it. If I just accept it, does it look like I deserve it, or I feel like I deserve it, or if I kind of say, oh no no no, does it mean that I'm belittling their take on something? You know what I mean? Maybe it's just my neuroticism in that sense.
No, I get that also. Yeah, we got some funding to help kind of offset the cost of editing the podcast videos, and that was huge. And at the same time, I felt guilty because like I read the blog post and it was like, sorry we couldn't, give money to everybody. And I'm like, I feel bad for taking the money, but I mean, it's helpful to the community. I know that, but you still feel bad because you're like, I'm not really doing anything but kind of just talking to people on here. I mean, I'm not taking any of the money for myself. It's all going straight to the editor. So I don't feel so bad. But at the same time, it's like I said, the blog post said, oh, we couldn't accept everybody. So, please apologize if you didn't get selected. It's like, well, how come we got selected? Like I said, I'm just chatting. Why is it that we get this? So yeah, isn't it called like imposter syndrome or something where it's like kind of the value that you bring, I think?
Yeah, I guess. And also, as well, I guess I can't speak for everyone, but for me personally, we've all come across someone who has overblown the trumpet, and then you do kind of see the negative consequences around it, where people kind of say, "Oh, look at them; they get a load of themselves." And then also, as well, you get like you also misjudge things. So you think something comes across in a certain way and it doesn't. So like when I was dating, this is obviously not very developer focused, but my story was that like my stepdad didn't have much, but they worked together really hard and they renovated homes and stuff. And now they've got very comfortable living. And to me, that was like a story of like, oh, if you're a teamwork, if you're a team, you can achieve great things. It was a really good relationship that I envied. And that's why I wanted to replicate something similar, and when I was dating. And this one girl's like replied to me saying, all you did was talk about how much money your mum had. And I was like, gosh, is that how it came across? So it's like, I guess sometimes as well, you're sometimes always double checking yourself and thinking like, oh, I think I'm being okay, but you know, maybe not. Or
Yeah, it's hard to say how you look from the outside, like sometimes I try to be nice and but still be direct in what I want to say, and it comes out on their side they receive it as not good. So I'm happy that at least in the Rust community, I think I said a couple of things to some people. And in hindsight, I'm like, actually, that's probably a bad like I have a good heart and a good thing I want to say, but sometimes the delivery is just not good. And luckily I haven't had anybody, get really offended by it. And if they did, I think I've apologized a couple of times, but and they kind of understand. The good thing about developers is a majority of us do have this kind of problem. And so it's not like expected, but it's something that to be aware of that people sometimes say things that they don't really the delivery is wrong is basically so that's the way to say it. So I'm happy that the Rust community is pretty forgiving, and as long as you don't mean it, then it's okay. So I'm pretty happy about
yeah,
that part.
I think the Rust Reddit community and so on is pretty good, and interactions on there are much nicer than let's say interactions on Twitter, where it gets it snowballs pretty aggressively. So yeah, I think that's another attraction to the programming language as well, actually. When I first entered into coding Rust, I did see when I started Googling it, there were people that were joking about like how Rust made a big point about the community being nice. And they were just like, oh, what's wrong with these guys kind of thing. Again, you don't know how the delivery was. Maybe they were being jokey, because it's typed. You can't really pick up tone of voice or anything. But the C++, there was quite a few comments, and something like that, where they were like, oh, why are they obsessing over their culture and to be nice? But as a result, I think it's actually developed a lot of really nice collaborations. It's been very
Yeah.
open. And I think gatekeeping has been close to zero that I've seen. Like, I mean, I can't speak for everyone.
Yeah, there's actually been a kind of an openness to step down, which I think is quite interesting for me. There's quite a few people who have stepped down, and it's been kind of somewhat applauded, right? Which is, I mean, like not like applauded, like we don't like this guy, but it's like, okay, you've reached your limit, and yeah, okay, like supporting that, because some people you need a break, right? Like Florian Gilcher is crazy busy, and he decided to step down, and everybody was kind of supporting of that, and somebody stepped in to take his spot for the Rust Foundation, which is that's good. So yeah, there's like you said, there's no gatekeep. That's kind of a form of gatekeeping, I would think, if you never want to step down from certain projects or whatever. But of course, there was a period where I felt like it was, I don't know, Rustgate or something, where there felt like every week or every couple weeks there was some crazy thing happening in the community. I don't want to bring up all the craziness that happened. I'm sure if you're in Rust communities more than me, which I think you are, I think you know what I'm talking about. It was like 8 months of just drama of stuff, and you're never going to get away from it. But it was just shocking to see all the drama because, yeah, the whole community is super supportive and very nice. It's like, well, why the heck is this happening? This is weird. and I had no idea about this stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad it all smoothed out, really,
Yeah,
you know, and very excited about, up and coming events in London and stuff like that.
yeah. And you're coming to Rust Nation, right? It's like around your home.
Yes, yeah. I mean, during my current situation, if it was anywhere else, I wouldn't go,
Yeah,
because I can walk there. It's
yeah.
definitely going to go. And there is quite a lot of Rust innovation happening in London, which is quite exciting. Like
Hmm.
I said before the podcast as well, Surreal DB, they're kind of based in London. They built their database in Rust. They kind of host get-togethers and that sort of thing as well. And also as well, I've been talking to Halfloop and potentially working with them in terms of like they want to rebuild medical data standards and they want to use Rust for that as well and have a standardized like protocol. So they've done very well as well in terms of their progress. So it's really exciting like time, I think, for web development as well. I think that the myth of it's you have to work so much harder to code in a web app in Rust. Because I think that was like the kind of I don't want to say defense, but reason to use JavaScript or Python was that you could be so productive in that compared to something like
Hmm.
C++. So I do think Rust is kind of revolutionary in this sense. As I said before, how productive you can be with the coding and then also all those speed gains and everything.
I think so. Also, that's what people are keep saying, and that's also a little bit of my experience from the limited amount of Rust I've did. But yeah, I just want to kind of go back to the book, right? So the book has been released, right? We can pick it up at Pact, Amazon, these kind of places already, right?
Yeah, Pact also do distributions to like Target or Waterstones or that sort of thing as well. They've got quite a wide distribution, and I think as well most universities can access it in some form or another. That would be generally what's going on.
Okay. So the name of the book again is called Rust Web Programming from Pact, or I call it Pact, but you call it Pact T. Is that actually really the way to call it? Is Pact T, or do you just call it Pact T?
Everyone I've spoken to kind of calls it Pact, but
Okay.
again, I don't know what's the real. You know,
Okay. I always call it Pact, but or Pack or Pact. Yeah. So
I'm sure if you say Pact, people know what you're talking about. So it's
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we did have another author from Pact or Pact T for the game engine from. Oh wow, the name is. It's been a long week for me. From Peyton Rules. I forgot his name now. He's actually very close to my hometown. I sadly didn't get a chance to meet up with him. So they got quite a few people around over there. Smith, I believe his last name is. It's a pretty cool book, right? So it's called Game Development Rust and WebAssembly. So I think Pact or Pact T has a lot of really, really cool Rust books, more than anybody
yeah,
else because they have such a wide range. So I think browsing there, it's like you can find. You remember the old saying? There's an app for that from iOS. It's
yeah,
like there's a book for
yeah.
that. Like if you want to know like Rust for I don't know biotech, you could probably search for it and find it on within that publisher. I'm guessing because they just have books about everything. It's amazing.
Yeah, and they were very keen on the Rust from early on.
Yeah.
When you spoke to them, they were like, "Yeah, we think Rust is going to have a good future and stuff." I will stress, it's like from what I understand, talking to O'Reilly and so, there's different styles.
Hmm.
So Pact like to be very expressive, and they like to assume like no knowledge. So if you introduce Docker, they're like you have to write a little bit on what Docker is and stuff like this. But when I talk to O'Reilly editors, they're very much like you can be a bit more niche and you can assume any sort of knowledge. That's reasonable, obviously. So I guess they have their different places in that sense.
Yeah.
So that's why we've got the two different approaches. The web programming is quite a bit of grounding, and it's for the adoption of web programming in Rust. So that's with Pact. The async Rust that I'm talking to O'Reilly with, it's a bit more like if you want to reach for a book on async Rust, you should have some grounding in Rust and that sort of thing, right? So that's where the different styles of publishers come into, really.
Yeah. And I mean, every publisher has their own style. Like not even yeah, like you said that one, and also the writing style and how you approach everything. So you'll find it. Yeah. Cool. I mean, is there anything else that we should know about the book, or you have any kind of codes or anything to kind of get a discount or anything like that? I know we didn't talk before
I
about that, but it's probably putting you on the spot.
No, yeah, I did. Because it's partly my fault. I pretty much responded quite quickly. I was quite excited because I do listen to your podcast, so I wanted to do it as quickly as possible. So I messaged the publisher this morning, and they were like, "We can't organize something that quickly." So I said, like, I'll give you their email, and I'm sure they can organize something where you get like your listeners will get some sort of access code or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Put them into touch with me. And I think this will come out next week or so. So worst case is I think they'll probably respond within a week with something.
Yeah.
So we'll figure that part out. So that'd be great if we can give them something and kind of get your book out there some more. Because yeah, this is. I mean, I think everybody's doing some kind of web work with Rust for the most part because you usually got to make APIs with it.
Yeah, and in the book as well, we don't really touch front end stuff really that much in Rust. Kind of use JavaScript, React, and stuff like that. I just found it. I kind of struggled with it a bit still, because I'm not really a front end developer. So it was like getting a grounding in React and then trying to translate those concepts and components to Rust in the time frame was too much. But WASM, WebAssembly is quite exciting in that sense. So maybe in the third edition, because the second edition has doubled in size compared to the first edition. So I guess in the third edition, it will most probably end its way in there. So
I hope in the third edition you'll cover full stack Rust because we're pretty close. I think there's a lot of choices now with WebAssembly and front end.
Yeah, and then going back to this, at the start of the podcast, you said about like being first mover or one of the first movers and trying to get second edition out. I can see some things that the software engineering community hasn't really picked up compared to, let's say, healthcare is very old and established. And the textbooks in healthcare, they kind of get really solid, like fifth, sixth edition. But you need to go through those iterations, and they end up becoming massive and they end up becoming these texts. So that's the kind of approach that I'm taking in terms of like, I'm constantly working on the next edition because I want it to get to quite a iterate, like you do with software and stuff, you iterate until it becomes very battle tested and that sort of thing. So hopefully, by third edition, full stack with WebAssembly should be a possibility. Well, it should be there.
Yeah. Well, please push that through. That'd be awesome because a lot of people are asking for that. They want to have full stack Rust. So
yeah.
And nobody's covering that yet, as far as I know. I think Rust web there was one for Manning, Rust services, apps, and something. I forgot the name. It's quite complicated, but we had him on the podcast already, and he did have a chapter about WebAssembly, but he actually took it out. I was quite surprised because I thought that one really made his book stand out to me because of that chapter.
Yeah, I think the practical experience of that is still a bit limited. So from my experience, we are going to start looking at WebAssembly because in our med simulation software, we actually have a chatbot that's trained for each patient and their past med history. And again, we needed something like Rust to do that. And our next move is to actually compile it with WebAssembly and have it in the front end. So it gets the patient data and then creates its own chatbot to really offload the computational power. But writing about that in this edition before I've even done it is not really. I'm just kind of asking for trouble there.
Yeah.
So and I think that's the same with other people. It takes a while because it's quite a paradigm shift. Like with microservices, you could just say like, oh, I'm going to try and build one server in Rust and see how it goes. Whereas you say like, I'm going to, compile something into WebAssembly and put it on the front end. There's like existing infrastructure can still get in the way. So if you just have a standard React app, then you're going to struggle. You most probably have to have some sort of framework like Next.js, and then it has to do like some sort of pre-rendering before it puts it on there. It's not. So I think there's still quite a few. Finding the problem to solve and then actually having the practical experience is still a bit limited, I think, with a lot of people. So that's, I guess, why it's taken its time. Because I had a few people message me about the first edition saying, "Could you put in front end stuff for the second edition?" And I underestimated it and said, like, "Yeah, sure." And they're probably going to be disappointed now because when you look at it, you're like, actually, I don't have enough practical experience in this. I didn't get around to actually deploying that into a live production. If I haven't deployed front end Rust into a live production, should I really be writing about it? It's a.
Mm-hmm. No, I know what you mean. Yeah, I mean, there's not many people doing full stack Rust. I think too. You kind of just specify one or the other. But yeah, again, I appreciate you coming on and talking about your book. I'm happy to see another Rust book and also another Rust web one because, yeah, we don't really have a lot of those, surprisingly. A lot of things are still like, basic Rust or more advanced topics within Rust itself rather than focusing on a specific kind of vertical like web development.
Yeah, it's certainly an exciting field. I think we are starting to prove the naysayers wrong in terms of when they said that Rust is just a systems language and it has no place in web development, which is nice. It's a nice contradiction as opposed to a bad one.
Well, don't challenge people. That's where you look like a fool when people challenge people. I've seen the brainfuck language, right? It's, you can program with it. It's not nice, but you can do it. So Yeah, just be careful. Don't challenge people because they'll write something and then make you look like a fool. And so, yeah, I've seen surprising things before. So I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by this one because it's being used in everywhere, right? Because it's systems programming language, it can be used in nearly everywhere, right? You can't be
Yeah,
building operating systems with Golang, right? That's the power of it.
that's true. In terms of brain fog, I always I'd never find a time, but I really want to like build something in just pure assembly, but I just never justified burning the hours. But I'm just too curious. Eventually, I'll do it and then regret doing it. But I guess it's just out of pure curiosity.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. Well, again, thank you for coming on the podcast, and we'll see if we can get a code from the author to pump up your book, right? So you'll be in more categories. You know,
Okay,
we'll see what category we can get you into.
nurse informatics or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe child psychology would be interesting. Just just something very random. I don't know why that one popped in my head, but something very random topic. All right. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you very much.